I moved into the neighborhood with nothing but the hope of finding a quiet place to finally settle down, away from the endless noise of city life and the chaos of apartment living. For years, I had worked in construction management, building commercial properties, overseeing road projects, and handling contracts that most homeowners associations could never even begin to understand. My work gave me an odd kind of edge. I not only understood how neighborhoods were designed and built, but I also knew the hidden legal language tucked deep inside property records that most people ignored. When I bought the small but beautiful brick house on the corner lot, I thought I was buying peace, stability, and a good place to rest my head. What I didn't know at that time was that the HOA, this smug group of self-appointed rulers who thought they owned every square inch of asphalt, concrete, and green grass, would eventually push me past every limit of patience I had. And it all began with a parking spot. At first, the spot seemed so simple. It was the one directly in front of my home, shaded by a big oak tree whose branches stretched out like arms welcoming me back every evening. I'd park my black Ford F-250 there after long days, my boots caked with dust, the truck bed sometimes filled with tools or lumber from a side job. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs, and kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac. For those first few months, life seemed good. Then one evening, as I pulled in after a long week on a downtown project, I noticed something strange. A small wooden post had been hammered into the ground at the edge of my parking space, with a bright yellow sign that read HOA permit parking only. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe some temporary thing. But by the weekend, they had painted the curb red and even had a contractor stencil the words, reserved HOA, in white paint across the pavement. My name, my address, my years of property taxes paid meant nothing to them. My spot was gone, stolen in the dead of night by bureaucrats who thought they could micromanage asphalt like it was part of their own backyard. I marched straight to the HOA office the next morning. It was a converted model home near the front of the neighborhood, smelling faintly of air freshener and self-importance. Behind the desk sat Linda, an HOA board member with a permanent scowl, frosted blonde hair, and the type of energy that made you feel like you were already guilty of something. She barely looked up from her computer when I explained the issue, instead handing me a printed sheet about updated parking policies and informing me in that nasal, clipped tone that the HOA had decided to redistribute parking spaces for the betterment of community flow. My space, apparently, was reassigned to one of their board members, a smug little man who lived 3 houses down and rarely even parked there because he owned 3-car garage space. Linda smirked as if it was all perfectly legal, perfectly normal, and I was just another angry homeowner whining about rules. I went home boiling with rage. At first, I considered just fighting them through normal channels, calling the city, filing complaints, hiring a lawyer. But then something in me shifted. See, unlike most homeowners, I had spent nearly 20 years dealing with zoning codes, easement rights, and right-of-way contracts. I knew that most neighborhoods, especially ones built in the last 30 years, didn't actually own the roads the way their HOA liked to pretend. Developers often sold off properties piecemeal but held odd rights-of-way, leaving ownership of the actual pavement either to the county or, in rare cases, the private landowner who had once owned the entire stretch. When I bought my corner lot, I hadn't just bought the house. I had also acquired a quirky old deed clause that included something nobody in this HOA had ever bothered to notice. I owned the road in front of my house, and in fact, because of the way the developer's original map was written, my deed gave me full ownership of nearly a third of the main street running through the subdivision. The asphalt, the curbs, the storm drains, they were mine, legally, indisputably, mine. It took me a week of late-night digging in dusty county records to confirm what I suspected. I went through microfilm files, scanned plats, and pulled deeds signed by men long dead, and every single scrap of paper backed me up. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my section of road. None. In fact, not only did they not own it, but they had been technically trespassing every single time they sent out their little landscaping crew to trim the edges, repaint the curbs, or place one of their smug little, permit parking, signs. My blood boiled hotter with every discovery. They had stolen my spot, mocked me to my face, and acted as if I was powerless. But the truth was the opposite. I had the kind of power they couldn't even begin to comprehend, the kind of power that made their painted red curb look like a child's crayon drawing on my property. The first thing I did was quietly remove their sign one night. I didn't smash it or burn it, I just unscrewed the bolts, yanked it out, and tossed it into my garage. The next morning, I parked my truck back in the spot. Sure enough, within hours, Linda and 2 other board members came marching up to my door, clipboards in hand. They started threatening fines, blustering about HOA regulations, and pointing to their little policy sheet like it was the US Constitution. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply handed them a photocopy of my deed, highlighted in yellow where it explicitly stated my ownership of the road section. They blinked at it like it was written in a foreign language. One of them stammered something about common property, but I cut him off with a steady voice. "This isn't common property," I said. "This is my property. Which means your sign was trespassing, your paint was vandalism, and your threats are harassment." The color drained from their faces, but pride kept them standing there longer than they should have. They muttered that their lawyers would be in touch. I smiled. Because I knew their lawyers would only confirm what I already knew, they were standing on my land, and they had no power here. But simply reclaiming my parking spot wasn't enough. The more I thought about their arrogance, the more I realized I couldn't just let this go with a smug smile and a few legal documents. No, they had tried to humiliate me. They had tried to strip away something that was mine. They had treated me like dirt, like some nuisance they could push around. And the truth was, I had every legal right not just to take back what they stole, but to make their entire little empire crumble. Because if I owned the road, I could control what happened on it. And if I controlled what happened on it, I could declare it unbuildable, unserviceable, and completely outside the reach of their HOA rules. Their fancy neighborhood, so carefully manicured, so strictly regulated, would suddenly find itself cut in half, with the main artery of their subdivision declared legally unfit for any HOA enforcement, construction, or regulation. Imagine the chaos: no more trash pickups on time, no mail trucks allowed without my permission, no community event banners strung across lampposts. Their whole precious system depended on a road they didn't own. And I held that road in my hands like a weapon. So I sharpened it. Over the next few weeks, I began the process. First, I filed official notices with the county, formally asserting my private ownership and rescinding any previous implied easement rights that had been abused. Then I hired a surveyor, just to drive the nail deeper, and marked off the exact boundaries of what I owned. Stakes went up in the ground, bright orange and impossible to ignore. Neighbors started asking questions, whispers spread, and the HOA board began sweating bullets in their little office. Then came the best part. I filed a declaration with the zoning commission stating that, due to safety concerns and improper HOA interference, my section of the road was now considered unbuildable and subject only to my private authority. In one stroke of the pen, I turned their precious street into my private driveway. And it was only the beginning. The fallout from my declaration didn't hit like a thunderclap all at once. It spread like a slow-burning wildfire, creeping under doors and into conversations until the whole neighborhood hummed with panic. At first, most of the residents didn't know what was happening. They just saw my survey stakes hammered into the ground, orange tape fluttering in the breeze, and the sudden absence of the HOA's usual landscapers along the curb in front of my place. They noticed that my section of road no longer had fresh paint, no new mulch, no neatly trimmed hedges courtesy of the community fees they paid monthly. By the second week, they were starting to ask questions. And by the third, when the garbage truck stopped making pickups on my section of road, because I had sent the county notice to restrict access without my permission, the whole HOA board was in full-blown crisis mode. Linda, the queen bee of their smug little hive, was the first to storm back into my yard. She came marching up with 2 men in polo shirts who looked like they thought their clipboards made them dangerous. She didn't even bother with her fake smile this time. Her face was red, lips tight, voice quivering with that brittle anger of someone used to control. She said the neighborhood was experiencing disruptions, and that my actions were causing unnecessary complications for community living. I leaned against the hood of my truck, arms crossed, letting her vent every syllable. Then I calmly told her that she had 30 seconds to step off my property or I'd have her arrested for trespassing. Her voice cracked when she shrieked, "You can't do that," but her eyes betrayed her. She knew I could, and worse, she knew I would. The two men shuffled uncomfortably before tugging her arm and steering her away. I watched them go, the satisfaction settling deep in my chest. For years, this HOA had acted like gods in their small kingdom, and now they were finally tasting what it felt like to be powerless. But power, I knew, was only useful if it was exercised fully. I wasn't just going to defend my parking spot, I was going to rewrite the rules of this neighborhood in a way they couldn't undo. So I called in a few favors. Old buddies from construction crews owed me drinks and weekends from jobs I had helped them land. One by one, they rolled in, surveyors, equipment operators, and even a paving crew. Within a month, I had fresh barricades set up at the ends of my road section. Bright reflective signs went up, all legally registered under my private property rights, private road. No HOA access. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The look on Linda's face the first time she drove up and saw those signs was worth every penny. She sat in her SUV for nearly 10 minutes, engine idling, staring at the metal barricades like her entire world had just been stolen out from under her. The residents started to notice in ways that hit harder. Mail delivery grew inconsistent because the postal service didn't want to fight a legal battle over access. Amazon drivers began calling residents to meet them at the entrance of the subdivision rather than risk a trespassing complaint. Trash piled up on the curbs. Landscaping crews refused to mow the HOA-mandated lawns that extended onto my property line. Suddenly, the pristine postcard-perfect image of their community looked ragged, unkempt, and embarrassing. And neighbors, the very people who had paid into the HOA's coffers and nodded along with their rules, began whispering blame. They didn't blame me, most of them were quietly thrilled to see someone finally stand up to the tyrants. They blamed the board. They blamed Linda. And the pressure began eating them alive. I remember the first board meeting after my declaration. They held it in the same little model home they always used, pretending to be professional with coffee, donuts, and legal pads. I walked in uninvited, holding a thick binder of county records under my arm. The room went quiet. Linda sputtered about this being a private HOA meeting, but I cut her off by slamming the binder down on the table. Papers spilled out, deeds, maps, and official stamped documents. I told them flat out, this road belongs to me. Your signs, your paint, your policies, they're worthless. Keep pushing me, and I'll not only shut down your access permanently, but I'll sue for damages for every year you've illegally claimed authority over my land. The silence was so deep you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably, others stared at their laps, and for the first time, Linda looked truly afraid. She wasn't facing a disgruntled homeowner anymore, she was facing a man who knew the system better than her lawyers and had the paperwork to prove it. What followed wasn't just a war over asphalt, it was psychological. The HOA began sending letters stuffed with threats of fines, liens, and legal action. I collected every single one, filing them neatly in a folder marked evidence. I responded only once, with a letter of my own, printed in bold black ink on crisp legal paper. It read, any further attempt to levy fines, place liens, or otherwise assert authority over property not under your ownership will result in immediate legal counteraction for harassment, fraud, and trespassing. Govern yourselves accordingly. That letter shut down half their noise, but pride kept them limping along with their crusade. They tried calling in county inspectors, but those inspectors all shrugged when I showed them the deed. They tried appealing to the zoning commission, but my official declaration of unbuildable status was airtight. Each time they reached for a weapon, it backfired in their hands. The real turning point came when I decided to tighten the screws. Owning the road meant I had the right to regulate utilities running under it. Most homeowners don't think about it, but gas lines, water mains, and fiber optic cables all run beneath the asphalt. Normally, easement agreements protect those services, but in this case, the original developer had botched the paperwork so badly that the rights defaulted to me. That meant the HOA couldn't authorize any repairs, maintenance, or expansions without my permission. So, when one of the streetlights went out, I refused access until the HOA paid me a maintenance fee. When a water pipe sprung a leak, I held off the repair crew until the board signed a document acknowledging my ownership. Neighbors weren't mad at me, they were furious at the HOA for letting things get this bad. With every broken light, every delay in service, every pile of uncollected trash, their anger sharpened against the people who had once bullied them with paint colors and mailbox heights. By the 6th month, the HOA was collapsing. Attendance at their meetings dwindled. Their newsletters became thinner, more desperate, filled with hollow promises that progress was being made and legal matters would soon be resolved. But residents had stopped listening. They were too busy knocking on my door to ask me directly what was going on. And I told them the truth, I wasn't their enemy. I wasn't against the neighborhood. I was against the tyrants who had stolen from me and thought they could get away with it. That honesty earned me more respect than any HOA board member ever got. People brought me pies, beers, and even offers to help around my yard. I went from being the guy with the stolen parking spot to the man who broke the HOA's chokehold on the community. Still, Linda didn't give up. Pride is a funny thing, it clings even when all evidence points to failure. She tried one last stunt, hiring a private security company to patrol the neighborhood and issue warnings to anyone parked on my section of road. I caught them on the second day, 2 guys in uniforms sitting in an SUV with magnetic decals slapped on the doors. I walked right up, knocked on their window, and told them they were trespassing on private property. They laughed until I showed them the deed and told them I was calling the sheriff. They peeled out so fast their tires left rubber on my pavement. I filed a report anyway, just to make sure there was a record. That was the final nail. The HOA had stolen my parking spot, but I had stolen their crown jewel, the illusion of power. Without control over the roads, without the ability to enforce their rules, they were just a group of neighbors in a living room complaining about how other people mowed their lawns. And I wasn't done yet. Because while I had already declared their street unbuildable, I had a much bigger plan forming. A plan that would make sure no HOA board, not this one or any in the future, would ever think about messing with me again. And it all started with the paperwork sitting quietly in my garage, documents that didn't just prove I owned the road, but gave me the right to legally dissolve any HOA jurisdiction that relied on it. I had the match, the gasoline, and the resolve. All that remained was striking the flame. When you spend your life in construction and land management, you learn something most people never realize: power doesn't come from who shouts the loudest, it comes from who holds the paperwork. People like Linda and her board thought power was a megaphone, rules printed in newsletters, fines written in bold letters, threats delivered in sharp voices. But real power was quieter. It lived in the dusty pages of deeds, in clauses hidden in zoning laws, in the signatures of developers who never thought their words would echo decades later. That's why I wasn't content with just barricading the road or embarrassing the HOA at meetings. No, I wanted to dismantle their authority brick by brick, using their own ignorance as the wrecking ball. I started with the bylaws. Every HOA has a constitution of sorts, a thick, jargon-filled binder of regulations that residents rarely read but are forced to follow. I got my hands on a copy, scanned it from cover to cover, and highlighted every section that referenced community property, roadways, and common areas. Then, armed with the official survey maps I dug up from the county archives, I cross-referenced every mention with the reality of my deed. What I found was devastating for them. Nearly a third of their policies rested on the assumption that the roads were under their jurisdiction. They weren't. That meant their parking regulations, their street use policies, even their annual beautification fees tied to road maintenance were void. Legally worthless. I drafted a 20-page memorandum, stapled the proof behind it, and mailed a copy to every homeowner in the neighborhood. The reaction was volcanic. Within days, residents were showing up at HOA meetings with copies of my memorandum in hand, demanding answers. Some were furious, shouting at the board for collecting illegal fees. Others were embarrassed, realizing they had spent years bullied into compliance that was never enforceable. The meeting erupted into chaos, with neighbors pointing fingers and shouting over each other while Linda tried to restore order with that shrill, commanding voice of hers. But the tide had turned. The room no longer respected her authority, because the illusion of control had been shattered. People now understood the HOA had no real teeth, not when it came to the roads, and not when it came to their wallets. I didn't stop there. I filed a petition with the county clerk to have the HOA's charter formally amended to exclude any authority over my section of property. Normally, these things take months to process, but thanks to a contact I still had in the zoning office, a man who owed me for helping him dodge a nasty contractor lawsuit years back, my paperwork flew through in record time. By the end of that month, the county records officially recognized what I had known all along: the HOA had zero legal standing on my land. That meant any attempt to fine me, harass me, or dictate terms was not just invalid but potentially criminal. I had effectively carved out a sovereign strip of land right through the middle of their suburban empire, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. The neighborhood began shifting in subtle ways. Where once the lawns were obsessively trimmed to regulation height, some homeowners started letting the grass grow a little taller. Where once mailboxes had been uniform and color-coded, new paint jobs appeared: bright reds, deep blues, even a few with designs painted by kids. People started parking trucks, boats, and RVs in driveways without fear. And they looked at me with nods of respect, even quiet gratitude. My little rebellion had freed them, too, and they knew it. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the boogeyman lurking in every mailbox. It was just a bunch of neighbors with a failing clipboard army. But Linda wasn't finished. She couldn't be. She had ruled this neighborhood for years, wielding her authority like a queen who believed the crown was fused to her head. The humiliation of losing to me, some newcomer with work boots and a truck, gnawed at her. She started sending out desperate newsletters, warning residents that without strict rules, property values would plummet, crime would rise, and chaos would reign. It was fearmongering at its cheapest, and fewer people were buying it. But she kept at it, clinging to her role like it was all she had left. Then she made her biggest mistake yet. One afternoon, I came home to find fresh white paint streaked across the barricades I'd set up. Sloppy letters spelled out HOA Road, trespassing void. It was amateur work, clearly meant as some symbolic act of defiance. But to me, it wasn't just vandalism, it was evidence. I had a security camera mounted under the eaves of my roof, and the footage showed Linda herself, sneaking out at dawn with a paint roller and a bucket, her hair tucked under a visor, glancing nervously up and down the street. I watched that footage 3 times, savoring it like a fine whiskey. Then I burned it onto a disc, printed a still frame of her mid-swipe, and delivered both to the county sheriff's office. Vandalism on private property. Clear as day. The deputies came for her that evening. They didn't haul her off in handcuffs, this wasn't a movie, but they did issue a formal citation and a court summons. The news spread like wildfire. The very woman who had fined residents for having the wrong shade of curtains, who had called the cops on teenagers for parking crooked, was now facing charges for defacing private property. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. For the first time, people laughed openly about the HOA. Laughed at it. The aura of fear was gone, replaced by mockery. And nothing destroys a tyrant faster than becoming the punchline of the very people they once controlled. While she flailed in the public eye, I tightened my grip behind the scenes. Remember that unbuildable status I'd filed? It wasn't just symbolic. It meant the county recognized my road section as unsuitable for any future development, modification, or structural use. That killed the HOA's long-term plans. They had been sitting on a proposal to add a new community center and playground, but their only viable access route cut straight through my property. With my declaration in place, the project was dead. I made sure everyone knew it, too. I mailed copies of the zoning denial to every resident, stapled with a note that read, "The HOA tried to take from me. In doing so, they cost you this project. Remember who's really at fault." By the end of that summer, the HOA was bleeding out. Residents were refusing to pay dues, some openly citing my memorandum as justification. Others demanded refunds for years of illegal fees tied to road maintenance. Their treasury, once fat with violation fines and community fees, was drying up fast. Contractors stopped answering their calls, lawyers refused to work on contingency, and their once proud newsletters were reduced to single sheets of paper begging for compliance. It was glorious, watching their empire crumble, not because I loved destruction, but because it was justice. They had stolen from me, they had tried to humiliate me, and now every brick of their castle was turning to dust in their hands. I knew the end was coming, but I wasn't content to let them collapse quietly. No, I wanted it written in stone. I wanted it official. So I began preparing the final blow, a petition to dissolve the HOA altogether. The law allowed it if enough residents signed on, and judging by the murmurs at barbecues and the quiet handshakes I received from grateful neighbors, I knew I had the numbers. The board was cornered, humiliated, and broke. Linda's citation case was looming, and the community's faith in her was gone. All it would take was my signature, a few more neighbors brave enough to join me, and the HOA would cease to exist. I had gone from losing a single parking spot to holding the fate of the entire neighborhood in my hands. And the best part? Every step of the way, I had done it not with fists or fury, but with knowledge, patience, and the law itself. They had tried to play me like a fool. Instead, I was about to write the final chapter of their rule, and it would end with their empire erased. The petition to dissolve the HOA moved faster than I expected. Momentum is contagious when enough people realize they've been taken advantage of. I walked the subdivision with clipboards and cold beers, explaining in plain language what the documents meant and what signing would do: free them from an organization that had overreached, returned agency to the homeowners, and stopped the petty bullying. Some folks were skeptical at first, old habits die slow, and many had been conditioned to equate an HOA with property value and safety. But once I laid out the facts about the road, the illegal fees, and Linda's citation, skepticism dissolved into anger and then action. People signed in droves. I watched as signatures filled pages like a flood seeping through a dam, and every name felt like another nail into the HOA's coffin. Meanwhile, Linda splintered into 1,000 different strategies: lawyers, PR ploys, frantic meetings with sympathetic neighbors who feared change. But each attempt to stall or derail us only made residents angrier. I was careful to keep everything legal, that was part of the point. My aim was to expose, not escalate, to use their own arrogance against them and hand the neighborhood back to the people who actually lived there. That legal precision kept us above reproach and strengthened our moral case. When the signature threshold was reached, I filed the petition with the county clerk and waited with a patience honed by years on job sites where concrete needed curing before you pushed it. The public hearing was scheduled on a bright Tuesday afternoon, and the model home that had once housed the HOA's throne room filled to standing room only. I watched faces, some were triumphant, some wary, and others quietly relieved. Linda sat at the front with her remaining supporters, people who still believed the world needed her orders, and she clung to them like a captain clinging to a sinking ship. Her lawyer stood at her shoulder and smiled the kind of smile that tried to look reassuring but couldn't hide the tremor of worry. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rant or boast. I laid out the facts, calmly and methodically, with maps and affidavits and the signatures of my neighbors, proof not just of legal standing but of community will. People in the gallery nodded. Even some of Linda's supporters looked downcast, their certainty visibly shaken. The county commissioners asked a few perfunctory questions and then, after what seemed like a long, endless minute, voted to dissolve the HOA. The applause was immediate and thundering, a sound that felt to me like justice and redemption braided together. I'd won, but the celebration felt oddly muted because victory hadn't erased all the damage that had been done. After the HOA dissolved, there were practical matters to settle: financial audits, distribution of community assets, and decisions about shared spaces like the pool and clubroom. I pushed for transparency at every step. I insisted that all records be made public, that contracts be nullified only after full accounting, and that anyone who had benefited illegally from HOA authority be required to repay what they had taken. Some of the residents grumbled at my insistence on thoroughness, calling it petty. Others thanked me later. I didn't want revenge for its own sake, only restitution and a firm end to the culture that had allowed abuse. As the audits unfolded, it turned out the HOA's books were sloppier than anyone imagined. Funds had been diverted into personal projects, vendors had been paid for services never provided, and a few board members had accepted favors that should have raised alarms. Those findings stung more than anything else, not because of the money, but because people had trusted their neighbors, and that trust had been corrupted. I saw sympathy in many faces and condemnation in others. In the end, we arranged for repayments and, where necessary, legal action to recoup funds. Some people left the neighborhood in the months that followed, tired of the drama or embarrassed by their own choices. Others stayed, determined to rebuild what had been broken. Rebuilding was messy and human and deeply necessary. We formed a neighborhood association, different in design and practice from the old HOA, based on volunteer boards, transparent budgets, and consensus votes rather than ironclad mandates. I chaired the first meetings not because I wanted the role, but because people asked for someone who understood the law and would shepherd them through the minefield of public records and county codes. We wrestled with everything: who would maintain the pool, how to manage shared spaces equitably, and how to create a code of conduct that respected different lifestyles without devolving into petty policing. The architecture of new rules was intentionally simple and reversible. If a policy seemed to become authoritarian, anyone could call for a vote to change it. It felt good to watch neighbors collaborate instead of cower. We started community projects, fixing the playground that had sat half-finished for years, organizing a summer block party, planting a native wildflower strip along the edge of my road to encourage pollinators. Small things, but they stitched people back together. The culture of fear and perfectionism that had once governed lawns and curtains was replaced with a pragmatic kindness that acknowledged we all made mistakes and deserved a second chance. Linda faded from the center of life there, her influence reduced to a whisper of what it had been. She moved out the following year, citing a desire to be closer to family, though everyone knew she'd lost face and power. In truth, the lessons of that entire episode were complex. Some residents who had backed her never admitted error. They grumbled quietly but accepted the new reality. Others apologized, surprising me by showing up at my door with homemade bread and sincere regrets. The neighborhood had been through a storm and was, gradually, healing. I watched as families who had once been afraid to paint their mailboxes unique colors now celebrated small rebellions: a colorful door here, a painted mailbox there, a front yard vegetable patch that children tended with pride. Life returned to something softer and truer than the rigid one-size-fits-all governance of the past. For me, the personal fallout wasn't purely triumphant. I'd won back my road and the respect of most of the neighborhood, but I'd also become a target for gossip, rumor, and a few bitter threats from holdouts who still resented what I'd done. There were nights I slept with one eye open, waiting for a retaliatory prank or worse. A pickup truck keyed my tailgate one evening, a few ugly graffitied messages appeared on my fence, anonymous letters slipped under my door with venomous rhetoric. None of it amounted to serious harm, but the cost of resistance had been real. I kept using the law as my shield, documenting threats, filing reports when necessary, and never responding with anger. That steadiness wore down the worst of the hostility over time. People came to learn that I wasn't interested in vendettas. I wanted a neighborhood where people respected each other and the law. The fact that many turned to me for advice on everything from tree disputes to boundary lines felt strange at first, but eventually felt right. I'd always been handy with a tape measure and a county map, and now I used those tools to help reform a fragile community into something healthier. A few years later, I took to keeping a small album with snapshots of the process, the survey stakes in the dirt, the first community meeting where people cheered, the wildflower strip blooming along the edge of my road, and a faded photograph of Linda's citation pinned next to a thank you note from a neighbor who'd once been too frightened to speak up. I kept those moments not as trophies but as reminders, that power can be abused, yes, but also that the ordinary person with knowledge and courage can fix injustice when they choose to act. People would still ask me sometimes, in a half-joking tone, what it felt like to own a road. I'd smile and tell them that ownership is less about signs and more about stewardship, about treating the asphalt and the land above the pipes with respect and responsibility. That line usually got a laugh, but the deeper point stuck. My ownership of that slice of pavement had forced a reckoning not just about property lines but about what it meant to be neighbors. There were moments, too, where the absurdity of it all lingered and made me shake my head. How thin the veneer of civility had been in my subdivision, how quickly it unraveled when the right lever was pulled. How much trust people place in institutions without reading the fine print. But there was another lesson I carried with me: bureaucracy is human-made and therefore humanly fixable. It can be redesigned, reformed, and redirected. That realization became the guiding principle for the neighborhood's new governance, and for the way I conducted my own life. Check the documents, ask the questions, don't be bullied by the sound of authority alone. I walked the streets sometimes just to see how people had reclaimed their front porches, how children played again without the fear of a sanction, and how the whole place carried on with a new, softer rhythm. It made me feel less like a lone avenger and more like a steward who'd nudged a community back toward common sense. And while the road I owned remained a physical marker of what had happened, it also became a symbol, one I never flaunted. I still parked in front of my house most nights, but I didn't sit there to gloat. I parked there because it was mine, yes, but also because I liked the view: neighbors walking dogs, couples chatting on porches, kids racing bikes along the edge of my property where we'd planted the wildflowers. The barricades came down eventually, replaced by a modest sign that read, simply, "Private Road, Respect Requested." It was gentler than the old metal signs and felt right for a neighborhood that had learned to treat each other with a little more humility. I'd started a war over a parking spot, yes, but what came afterward was something I hadn't expected: a chance to build something more honest in its place. The HOA board thought they could intimidate me by escalating their tactics, but all they did was fan the flames of my determination. I wasn't just some guy with a garage and a few cars, I was a man who believed in standing my ground. When I bought this property years ago, I had no idea that the road running past my house would someday become the center of a war with a group of petty tyrants. But the more they pushed, the more I realized this wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about principle. It was about property rights. It was about not bowing down to a self-appointed group of neighbors who acted like they were running a miniature dictatorship. Their arrogance had reached a breaking point, and my patience was gone. They had stolen my spot, mocked me, and treated me like I didn't belong on my own land. That was their final mistake. I began by pulling records from the county courthouse. I had been digging since the early days of this dispute, but now I combed through every deed, every plat map, every easement, and every scrap of legal paperwork attached to this neighborhood. What I discovered gave me a surge of satisfaction so strong I nearly laughed out loud in the silent records room. The entire road network of the HOA subdivision, including the street where my stolen spot sat, was still technically owned by me. Years ago, when the developer sold the lots, they never formally transferred road ownership to the HOA. The county had refused to adopt the streets because they didn't meet code. And because I had purchased the undeveloped tract directly from the bank during a foreclosure sale, the roads had legally reverted to me as part of the deal. In other words, the HOA had been using my roads the entire time, completely unaware they were trespassing every single day. The moment I realized this, my anger transformed into cold, strategic clarity. These people had written me fines, harassed me with fake citations, and stolen what belonged to me, yet they had been driving on my land every morning to get to work, dropping their kids off at school using my pavement, and even holding community events on what was legally my private property. If they wanted a war, I had just found the nuke. I didn't make my move right away. Timing was critical. I quietly hired a land surveyor and had the entire subdivision road system remapped under my ownership. I recorded easement notices at the county office, ensuring that my legal rights were not only preserved but ironclad. Then, I started drafting letters. Not angry, rambling letters like theirs, but professional legal notices prepared with the help of an attorney I'd worked with before. These letters informed the HOA that, effective immediately, they were using private property without consent and would need to negotiate formal access rights if they wished to continue. Failure to comply, the letters stated, would result in roads being barricaded and declared unbuildable under county zoning ordinances. When the HOA president received the first notice, she called me directly, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You can't do this," she snapped. "These are our streets." I chuckled. "Actually, they're mine. I've got the deeds and filings to prove it. You should have checked your paperwork before harassing the guy who owns the ground under your tires." The silence on the line was delicious. Then came the sputtering rage. "We'll fight you in court," she shouted. "By all means," I replied calmly. "But until then, every car that drives on these streets is trespassing. Including yours." And I hung up. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to chaos. I had contractors install temporary barriers at both entrances to the subdivision, bright orange barricades with large private property signs bolted to the front. The only cars allowed through were mine and those of visitors I explicitly approved. The HOA board members came storming to my house like a pack of furious hornets, waving papers and threatening lawsuits. I stepped outside with my attorney beside me, who simply smiled and handed them copies of the county filings. Their angry faces shifted to pale panic as they realized this wasn't a bluff. The road they thought they controlled, the road they fined me over, wasn't theirs at all. Parents panicked because the school buses refused to enter once the private property signs went up. Delivery drivers turned around. Trash pickup halted. The HOA, once so smug and superior, was suddenly paralyzed, their little empire crumbling because they had built it on land they didn't own. They had stolen my spot, mocked my property rights, and tried to crush me with their fake authority, but now they couldn't even get Amazon packages delivered without my say-so. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once glared at me in board meetings were suddenly knocking on my door, begging for me to lift the barricades. Some offered apologies. Some offered money. A few offered outright bribes. I didn't budge. "You all wanted to play the game," I told them coldly. "Now you get to live by the rules. My rules." Meanwhile, I filed a declaration with the county zoning board officially designating the roads as unbuildable. That meant no upgrades, no expansions, no future development without my consent. The HOA's dream of expanding their subdivision or raising property values through improvements was dead in the water. Realtors stopped showing houses in the area. Property values nosedived. The same board members who had fined me for parking in my own driveway were now fielding angry calls from homeowners watching their investments collapse overnight. I could have stopped there. I could have leveraged my ownership to force them into submission and then granted access with conditions. But I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done. Every smug letter, every fine, every threat they threw my way, I wanted it to echo in their heads as they sat trapped in their fancy homes, unable to drive down the street without technically trespassing. The HOA president tried one last desperate stunt. She called a special emergency meeting and attempted to pass a motion claiming eminent domain over the road. I showed up to that meeting with my surveyor, my attorney, and a stack of notarized filings. When she started blustering about their authority, I raised my hand and asked, "Show me the law that gives a homeowners association the power of eminent domain." The room went dead silent. Neighbors stared at her as she fumbled for words, realizing she had no answer. The vote failed spectacularly. That was the moment the HOA officially broke. The board members resigned one by one, some under pressure from furious neighbors, others because they simply couldn't handle the humiliation. The once mighty HOA dissolved into chaos, with homeowners arguing among themselves about how to fix the mess. And me? I sat back and watched, a quiet smile on my face. They had stolen my parking spot, tried to make me a prisoner in my own home, and laughed at my resistance. But I had flipped the board. I owned the road. And in declaring their precious street unbuildable, I hadn't just won, I had ended their reign entirely. The collapse of the HOA didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was total. For years, they had strutted around this subdivision like monarchs, handing out fines and citations, holding meetings where they acted like gods of the neighborhood. But when the truth of the roads came out, it was like someone had kicked the legs out from under their throne. One by one, their schemes unraveled. With the board dissolved and the HOA effectively crippled, the neighbors were left to fend for themselves. And that's when reality hit them harder than anything I could have done. Without the HOA, they had no structure, no plan, no control. What had once seemed like a neatly ordered neighborhood with rules and fines to protect property values, turned into a collection of panicked homeowners realizing they had built their lives on a lie. At first, I simply watched the chaos from a distance. Homeowners who once cheered on the HOA's fines against me were now screaming at each other over landscaping disputes, barking dogs, and parking wars. Without the HOA to play judge and jury, there was no one to enforce their little complaints. Some neighbors embraced the freedom. They painted their houses wild colors, parked boats in driveways, and turned their front yards into gardens. Others hated it, feeling like their investments were melting away with every perceived eyesore that popped up. The same people who mocked me for standing against the HOA were now realizing that the system they defended so fiercely had been a facade, a scam propped up by arrogance and weak legal footing. But I wasn't finished, not yet. You see, while the board dissolved, the problem of ownership was still mine to wield. The streets remained private. My streets. My rules. I didn't barricade every day. I didn't want to trap innocent families or punish kids who had no part in this war. Instead, I kept the barricades up sporadically, just enough to remind them that I held the cards. Every so often, I'd send out formal notices: trespassing violations have been recorded. Please remit payment or seek legal easement agreements. Most ignored the letters, assuming they were bluffs. But then I took one homeowner, one of the loudest complainers who had sided with the HOA against me, to small claims court for repeated trespassing. The judge looked over the deed, the filings, and the maps and ruled in my favor without hesitation. That homeowner walked out owing me thousands of dollars in damages, and the rest of the neighborhood suddenly realized I wasn't bluffing. The irony was delicious. The same people who had supported the HOA's endless stream of fines were now facing real ones, except this time, they weren't going into the HOA's coffers, they were going straight to me. And unlike the HOA, I had actual legal standing. No one could complain to the board, no one could vote me out, no one could override me. I had become the authority they had once tried to use against me, except my authority wasn't built on arrogance or fake power. It was written in ink on the very deeds of the land. The president of the former HOA tried to rally a resistance. She sent letters, she called meetings, she even tried to bring in the county commissioner to challenge me. But every time she thought she had me cornered, she hit the same brick wall, the paperwork. She couldn't undo the foreclosure sale, she couldn't transfer ownership of the roads retroactively, and she couldn't force the county to adopt streets that didn't meet code. She had lost, and no amount of rage could change that. In the end, she moved away in shame, selling her house at a massive loss. Her downfall was the sweetest victory of them all, because it was she who had laughed in my face when they stole my parking spot, smugly declaring the HOA's authority. Now, her authority was gone, her power stripped, her reputation in tatters. Over time, the neighborhood adjusted. With no HOA, the families who truly valued community began working together informally, helping each other instead of policing one another. Some neighbors even came to thank me, admitting that while they had hated me at first, they could now see how corrupt and destructive the HOA had been. A few even asked if I would consider selling the roads to them collectively, so they could manage them responsibly. I thought about it long and hard. Part of me wanted to wash my hands of it, to let them deal with the mess. But another part of me enjoyed the poetic justice too much. I wasn't cruel, but I wasn't about to let them forget what they had done. I agreed to grant them access easements, temporary, renewable, and entirely conditional on my terms. Every few years, they would have to come back to me, hat in hand, to renegotiate their right to use the ground beneath their cars. As for me, I found peace in the chaos. I had fought the HOA with everything I had, and I had won not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by a power-hungry board. My victory was more than personal, it was symbolic. It was proof that standing up to arrogance, no matter how small or petty it seems, can topple even the most entrenched tyrants. Every time I walked out to my driveway and parked in my spot, the one they once tried to take from me, I felt a rush of pride. Not just because it was mine, but because it represented something bigger. Years later, when people asked me about the Great HOA War, I would laugh and tell them the simple truth: they stole my parking spot, and in return, I stole their empire. They underestimated me. They thought I was just another homeowner who would bow to their fines and threats. But I wasn't. I was the man who owned the road. And in declaring their street unbuildable, I didn't just take back what was mine, I made sure they could never take from anyone else again.